Okay, here we are in Daniel, right? Daniel chapter 10. So what we have here, remember Daniel, he is a young boy when the Babylonians came in, the Assyrians came in and utterly destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the country of Israel and everything they had. And they took captive a few of the residents. Everybody else got slaughtered. But it was a decent number that they brought back. But only the more wealthy ones, only the better ones, more educated ones, even the better looking ones. And they brought them back to Babylon to build that capital. So the Syrians, everybody else was trash. Their capital, their culture, it was supreme. And that's kind of how they ruled the world. And Daniel grew up to be a Babylonian ruler, second in power to the governors, as we've talked about and read about all the way through. At this point, Daniel is very old. He's outlived the kings of Babylon, and now the Persians have come in. They knocked out the Assyrians, then come the Persians. The Persians had a completely different view. They didn't want to build some foreign capital like Babylon. In fact, they wanted the countries they conquered, the people they conquered, they wanted them back out where they were, because that's where they kind of belong, and they can generate more revenue, and they can help in the army and defend their areas. So the Persians had a completely different foreign policy, if you will, about how they managed things. And miraculously, for the Israelites living in Babylon at that time, the king, and you can read about it, it's a fascinating story, had a change of heart about Jerusalem. These are people who thought they would never see Jerusalem again. So 2 generations later, about 50 years, everything changes, and now the king is saying, yeah, you guys want to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild it the best you can? Go right ahead. You have my blessing. You have some finances to help you. Go. And in this period of time, we see a divide. Some of the Israelites said, well, here we are in Babylon. We were born here. We have our positions here. This is kind of our culture. This is where we're going to be. And you can still see their descendants, well, until recently, they're in Baghdad, continued. But some did go back. In fact, probably close to the majority went back to rebuild the walls in Jerusalem. During this time, Daniel, maybe because of his age, you really don't know. When you get to heaven, you can ask him. He didn't go back. He stayed there in Babylon. And this is the period. So this is the time. Remember last week we talked about how Daniel would pray with this window open to Jerusalem with the hope that someday that would be restored to them. So he had this great hope. And here it was realized God answered that prayer. So at this point, we are 2-3 years into this now. And Daniel is probably on cloud 9. He's lived his entire life. He was taken from Jerusalem. He himself can't go back, but the others have gone back. So he's seen the whole cycle of loss and rebirth, rising again from the ashes of the great city of Jerusalem. And so he's enjoying this when God gives him a terrible vision. Why would God do that? Everything's supposed to be going well. But God gives Daniel a vision that terrifies him. And the vision is basically this. Daniel, there is more war, there is more bloodshed to come than you can ever imagine. We don't have a lot of details, gory details, about how that actually takes place. History says it did take place just as the vision was. But we looking at it, we can't see all the things that were going on in Daniel's mind. But this vision absolutely terrified him. It paralyzed him. The fear of what was going to happen. I've been terrified. I've been paralyzed with fear about what I imagined was going to happen. I know I've been there. I know what it's like. I think all of us, to some extent, some more than others, have that fear of what is going to happen. Perhaps your parent is acting in a terrible, destructive way. And then you project out, what does that mean for me? What are the consequences going to be for me? Perhaps, your place of work is going through terrible times of change. You're projecting out, well, how is that going to leave me? And I feel victimized by that. Perhaps it's a child that's gotten into some terrible addictions and some behavior, and you're just completely distraught. And while your child might be okay right now as far as physically, you can see where that child is going to go, what the situation is, and it just scares you to death, thinking what is going inevitably will happen to my child. So these are things. And Daniel is here. Daniel was so terrified by this vision that he stopped eating. He started praying and fasting. The Bible says for 3 weeks, 21 days. He didn't take care of himself. His outward appearance was really bad. Things weren't going well. And at some point during this, he finds himself on the edge of the Tigris River. Still there, still named the Tigris. You probably geologically can find how the Tigris meandered through that part of the country and find the spot where Daniel was when God came to him in a second vision. And this is what we're going to pick up here. It's in chapter 10. We're going to read the very first few verses of chapter 10. And you can follow along here with me. Daniel chapter 10, and we're going to look at verses 5 and 8. And he says, I looked up and saw a man dressed in linen clothing with a belt of pure gold around his waist. His body looked like a precious gem. His face flashed like lightning, and his eyes flamed like torches. His arms and feet shone like polished bronze, and his voice roared like a vast multitude of people. Only I, Daniel, saw this vision. The men with me saw nothing, but they were suddenly terrified and ran away to hide. So I was left there all alone to see this amazing vision. And what we have here is the unveiling or the curtains pulling back to show us today what Daniel had a glimpse of, and Christians, humanity, has thought and wondered and asked about, and the Bible says very little about this. But the place where it says the very most in one place, it's right here in Daniel chapter 10. And what he sees another realm. He sees the spirits of good and the spirits of evil doing battle. And the idea, the central theme to us in all of this account, and certainly all of Daniel, is in our conflict, we are not alone. In our conflict, we are not alone. And let's continue verse 8 and through 9. It says, my strength left me. My face grew deathly pale, and I felt very weak. Then I heard the man speak. And when I heard the sound of his voice, I fainted and lay there with my face to the ground. And so we have here's a messenger from God who has come to Daniel to talk to him about this vision, and most importantly, to strengthen him, to lift him up again. And you know, when you are in that paralyzed state of fear, every once in a while, when you look for God and you pray to God, God will appear. I've had that in my own life. In fact, I don't have one moment in my life that stands out above the rest. A lot of people do. I don't. I have a consistency kind of a thing where I'm at my very weakest and I fear the most. But at some point in my life, I realize that only God can help me. And it's in that terrifying moment, always through the tears, that I come before God, and I'm kneeling before God, and many times I feel a presence that come near me. And it's not that kind of feeling where just imagine. You know, when you're in a room and somebody comes up behind you and you have no idea why, you know that there's somebody behind, but you know there's somebody behind you. That's the kind of feeling I get. And I get that, and in a moment, not very long, I feel an assurance. I feel a peace. And then, whatever the situation, I've heard different things over the years. It's always a word of great encouragement, touches my heart, and helps me greatly. Daniel has this, and this angelic messenger from God touches Daniel 3 times. And each of those 3 times, he encourages him, and he gives him strength. And so I like to kind of think of this as celestial first aid. When you really need it, God sends a being. God sends him sometimes himself in our day. But in Daniel's day, it was an angelic being that administered to Daniel 3 touches of celestial first aid. And the 3 things that we need to remember when we are standing in faith are these. Number 1, God cares about you more than you do. Imagine that, because I really care about myself. God cares about you more than you do. God cares about me more than I do. That's a fantastic thought. We have here the angel touching Daniel. Just then a hand touched me and lifted me still trembling, to my hands and knees. And the man said to me, Daniel, you are very precious to God. What a word, huh? You are very precious to God. Have you ever thought about that? You are precious to God. You are very precious to God. So listen carefully to what I have to say to you. Stand up, for I have been sent to you. When he said this to me, I stood up, still trembling. The Puritans, the early pilgrims that began the history of our nation, is most popularly told. They had a funny saying. They said, God has two thrones. One throne in the very highest of heavens, the second throne in the very lowliest of hearts. That's where God reigns. That's where God's presence. And I thought, what a beautiful and what a powerful thing. Yes, God's presence is in the highest of heavens, and simultaneously, he is also in the very lowliest of hearts. He's in the heart of those who are humble before God. We looked at Daniel here, and he's on his hands and knees. He is terrified. You and I have been there. What do we do with Daniel? Do we feel bad for him? Do we feel sorry for Daniel? Oh, this is terrible. Here he is, a great man of God. Here he is that has saved his people. Here he is, a person that God can speak through so quickly. How is it that he is now suffering? How is it that he can be going through so many hardships? Even more, how can God do this to me? Didn't God promise me better? Didn't God do this? Didn't God do that? And we go through times of suffering. Most of the time, not for ourselves, but suffering for care and concern about somebody else and what is happening in their lives. And in the midst of all that, we kind of defy God. How can I be the one that's not doing well here? What is wrong with this picture? All the while, God reminds us constantly that yes, suffering is part of our human experience. Suffering is kind of how the things that come to us and things we have to deal with. But in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of things that we don't think belong there, and while they are there, this is the truth. God gives us the strength to bear up under it. God will be there at that moment that you think you will not survive, at that moment where you think you will not survive, when that moment arrives time-wise and you are standing there in the present, you will find God standing with you, giving you the strength you need to bear up under it. And as you are being held up under it at that time, you will make a conclusion, and this is the conclusion. I have learned so much, been being drawn into the presence of God and to see him displayed in my life at this terrible time. But I have learned so much about God. I've learned so much about his love for me. I've learned so much about his faithfulness and his goodness in the most terrible of times. I have to say it's been worthwhile. The things that I have learned, I wouldn't wish on anybody else, kind of wish I hadn't gone through, but I would not want to be alive not having learned this lesson that I've learned through this, about the goodness and the faithfulness of the presence of God in my time of need. That's how we go through. And we go through and we see that, and we're grateful for it, and we do hear this voice, we do feel his presence. God actually saying to us, boy, you are so precious to me. You are so important to me. That God cares more about you and I than we care about ourselves. The second thing that we want to bring, God is doing more than you understand. God is doing more than you understand. Then he said, don't be afraid, Daniel. Look at this. Since the first day you began to pray for understanding and to humble yourself before God, your request has been heard in heaven. Since the first day he started to pray about this, when he was terrified for the first time from that vision, your request was heard on that day, the first day, in heaven. I have come in answer to your prayer. Now look at this. This is very interesting. Another glimpse into the supernatural world. But for 21 days, the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia blocked my way. Then Michael, one of the archangels, came to help me, and I left him there with the spirit prince of the kingdom of Persia. And so what we see here, and I really cannot explain it to you, it is what it is. It's a glimpse of heaven, and God heard Daniel's prayer. God sent a messenger with a word of encouragement to Daniel, and as that messenger was coming to Daniel, evil spirit, the prince of Persia, and then prince of Greece, there's all different names, prohibited him from reaching Daniel for 21 days. And remember, how long was Daniel praying and fasting? 21 days before God reached. And so it's interesting to me that during those 21 days, the answer was on its way, but unbeknownst to you and I, what we see, there was something going on with the principalities and the powers that be. And what are we to do with that? I don't know, except this. We are to continue what we can do, which is to, what the Bible calls, travail in prayer. Be persistent in our prayer, to not give up, to know that God is on his way, that God is doing something, but there is a much bigger picture to this world than we understand. You ever be in a situation where somebody who doesn't have a lot of authority comes to you and they say, why don't you do this? And it's a really great idea for somebody not in authority. But for the person who's responsible for a whole lot, that one little good idea has enormous ramifications. Crazy complicated. You've got to work through bureaucracies. You've got to be able to pass people who are stubbornly authoritative and do not want anything. You've got to find a way to work through all of that. The person, the innocent person, is just making a request, but they have no idea all that is at stake and all the things that have to be done and the prices that have to be paid and the things that need to be negotiated. It's very easy to say, hey, God, why don't you do this? But there's always a bigger picture to it, isn't there? Even in our own realm. But in God's realm, there's also a bigger picture. And what we can do is wait upon God to come through and God to do what God needs to do. To correct the culture, correct the atmosphere, the spiritual atmosphere around us. For us to realize that our battle is not just me and you, but our battle that we fight is also in the heavenly realms, among the principalities and powers that Paul talks about and leads us to. In the Old Testament, it's very interesting. There's a stark difference, isn't there, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And a lot of people criticize the Old Testament at this very point. But you can see the development of this. And it's fascinating to know this. It's more helpful now to me to know this difference. What do people criticize in the Old Testament? How violent God's people were. And God's direction to tear people down and destroy people and annihilate people and genocides. Things are just part of everyday war. Now, we look at it and we think, oh, what is this? But back then, genocide, that's just a normal course of strategy in warfare. That's what we do. We wipe everybody out. Actually, it hasn't only changed here even in the last few decades. But regardless, we always look at that and say, how could God be so this? But this is the shift that happened. In those days, the battle was always with people. And if people represented the evil, if people represented or embodied the evil spirit, those people were to be gotten rid of or resisted in the very least. Get rid of them. They are the issue. They are the problem. But then when Jesus Christ came, a very interesting shift happened. Jesus was no longer battling people. He no longer battled people. He battled the principalities and the powers and the spiritual forces. Jesus moved into the people to help them and to work with them and to try to bring them to the Father. He did that. But what was the remarkable work of Jesus? It was in this supernatural realm. Even something as simple as the Lord's Prayer illustrates this, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That's in the supernatural realm. Thy kingdom come, supernatural realm. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In heaven, where the big picture is, the realm, thy work be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's the supernatural realm. And then it brings it down, into our, give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses. We forgive those who trespass against us. And then right back into the supernatural realm. And, do not lead us in temptation, but deliver us from evil. Well, I was wondering, what's deliver us from evil? Don't lead us into temptation. I thought I was, qualified to lead myself into temptation. What do you mean, avoid evil? It's just all about it. No, he's referring to the bigger picture. The bigger picture. For thine is the kingdom, Thine is the power. Thine is the glory forever. These are all words that illustrate the other realm, the supernatural, the principalities and powers, the good spirits against the evil spirits. Jesus was in tune with that. If you read through the Gospels, it really opens your eyes to see, wait a minute, the battle Jesus does is with the spirit world. It's not with the people. And that is the great shift. And it's expressed for us in our own habit and how we approach people. That we are to engage people to bring them into the presence of God, but at the same time our battle is not solely with them. Our battle is with Satan and those who follow him. Well, who are these demons? Well, I don't have a good answer. The Bible doesn't give much clarity to this. It's usually assumed that when Satan was cast out of heaven, he was cast out with 1/3 of the angels, and those are the angels that belong to his army, and we call those the demons. 2/3 remained in heaven and continued to be faithful to God. And so the numbers all the way from Genesis to Revelation, the numbers are always 2 against 1, however that is. So we always know who the victory is and who the victory belongs to. I had a fascinating experience this week. It really touched my heart. What happened was, there was a girl in my youth group when I was a kid, and and we're all old now. But anyway, she texted me on Facebook. She said, "Hey, I'm coming to San Francisco with my sister. You live near there, right? Can you meet us?" Oh yeah, I'll meet you. It's great. I got all excited, and went over there, whatever day of the week it was. Met her for lunch. Took her to the Cliff House. But on the way, I was trying to drive through Embarcadero, and she says, your dad, my dad was the pastor, your dad made a fantastic impact on our family. Okay, that's something nice to say, right? Oh, thank you, I'll let him know. Thinking the conversation is going to move on. She told me this very powerful story. And what happened, I was crying all the way down Embarcadero. It just really touched me. And this is the story she told. She said, how I started coming to your church, or your dad's church. I said, yeah, I know exactly how it was. What happened was my mother's aunt, was visiting us in Brazil, the capital there, Brasilia. They had gone to a grocery store, and they're, like people do here, they're talking in their own language, English, and this girl named Anne, she heard my mother and my aunt talking together, and she was fascinated, like Jack Ma kind of a thing, with somebody speaking English. And so she went over, and with her broken English, and my mother loved that. She's an English teacher, and created a connection. And very soon invited them to church, started coming to church. Within about 2 months, a terrible tragedy happened in this family. She had 2 brothers, and they were at a little restaurant, sidewalk restaurant, when a fight broke out. And her brother was shot right there in the restaurant. And died. The older brother was traumatized by this. And so our family, our church, everybody participated during, trying to figure out, how to be of assistance, try to help support the family. And we went through that whole thing. And that's all I really knew about the story. And, and they continued to come to church. And here she is visiting me, 50 years later. But then all the way down, Mark, she tells me a different perspective to this. And this is what she says, did you know that a couple weeks after that my brother, the one that survived, he tried to commit suicide? I said, no, I didn't know that. She said, yeah. He, because of what happened, he started having seizures. And so the doctor prescribed some pills for his epileptic seizures to help him. And then what he did was he took the whole bottle in an attempt to commit suicide. And she said, it scared us to death. And his body was convulsing, he was doing terrible things. We called an ambulance, and the ambulance came and took him. They're a very poor family, took him to a public hospital. We don't have that. Some of you know what I'm talking about when I say public hospital. A street is sometimes cleaner than a public hospital in those years. And a neighbor would provide better care than a lot of the doctors in a public hospital in those years. Took him down, and she said, I didn't know what to do. We didn't have money for a doctor. Doctors won't treat if you don't have money. So I called your dad at 2 in the morning. She says, you could do that in the old days. You can't do that now. No, you can call me. Do it. But, she think that. And she says, your dad said, I'll be there immediately. And I didn't know. I never heard the story. My dad found the little boy, young man, found him in the hallway on a cart. And they had just given him some pills to get everything in his intestines out. And it was discharging, to use the nicest word I can think of, everything. It was just a mess. My dad came and found him in that situation in the hallway, completely forgotten by everybody else. My dad, being an old-fashioned kind of person, he always walked around with a white handkerchief. He went to the white handkerchief, and he cleaned up as much as he could around the boy and the mat. He went back to the sink, washed it out, came back, cleaned him up some more. Sink, came back, cleaned him up some more. And then when the family arrived, they came in, they saw their son. When everybody else was filthy, they saw that their son was on this mat, and his whole bed with a car was sparkling clean. He was clean, and my dad was kneeling in all of the filth with his hands folded on their son's chest. And she said that her mother said, "I never thought I would see somebody who loved my son more than I do." And that was her impression when she saw my dad kneeling in the midst of all that, having cared for her son and praying for him with all of his heart that this boy would live. And I remember thinking of that story, it just seared into my heart. And I called, "Dad, do you remember anything?" I didn't tell him those. No, I don't remember that. I don't remember that at all. But I remember that story speaking to me in a powerful way, that look how God was arranging for all of this. When my mother and my aunt go to a grocery store, that's where it began. I don't know all the things that happen in between, but I do know that God, his timing is perfect. And he lets things happen for unbelievable, unknown reasons. But that God's presence is real, and that God's presence is powerful, and that God intervenes from another realm into our world to remind us that we are precious to him, that we are meaningful to him, and he is here to pick us up and to encourage us and to help us. I see that played out day in and day out, time and time again. Let me take us to our third one. God's strength is made perfect in weakness. God's strength is made perfect in weakness. And here is Daniel talking to this angelic messenger. "How can someone like me, your servant, talk to you, my Lord? My strength is gone, and I can hardly breathe." Then the one who looked like a man touched me again, and I felt my strength returning. "Don't be afraid," he said, "for you are very precious to God. Peace, be encouraged, be strong." So here is Daniel. He can hardly breathe. He's so despondent and so exhausted. And here's this angelic presence saying, again, don't be afraid. You are very precious to God. Peace, be encouraged, be strong. That's what God says to us. Why is it that we look at our suffering and we take that as a definite proof that things are not going well for us? Right? We measure that. The more we suffer, well, that's the worst things. We're going down the wrong road. This is not good. Why does 1 + 1 = 2 in that sense? Because in reality it doesn't. God allows us to go through these things, but the truth of the gospel is that he is victorious. He is the one that wins, regardless of how much we suffer. Regardless, God wins. He always leads us through that time. We are the victorious. And so for the Christian, it's not that we're happy. It's not that we're oblivious. No, we do suffer. We do cry. Our lives are broken. We experience tremendous pain. We are exhausted. We feel like everything is gone. Yes, that's a part of our normal experience. That is all built on a foundation that underlines all of our suffering, that says this is temporary. As we move out of this phase, there will be a day when God will see to the victory. God will make it victorious. So people look at us and they say, look how much you're suffering. You're obviously going to be defeated. For the Christian, yes, look how much I am suffering. Yes, it is terrible. But you are wrong when you say, I will ultimately be defeated, because I will not. My life belongs to God, and God wins. Very much like on D-Day. You got to read in your history books about D-Day when the Nazis, they're all arrayed trying to protect Europe, and the Americans arrive. They're on the shores of France, and Eisenhower sends out the troops, and they invade. They invade with a fantastic force Europe. On that day, everybody, including Hitler and all the Nazis, they all knew it's over. It's just a matter of time. And then there's another day, they called it V-Day. That was for victory. That's the day when the war ends in the European. That's when the war ends. So there's D-Day, the day that this is the end. We've won. Now we just got to go clean everything up. But then we get V-Day, which is Victory Day. In our lives, it's very much the same. When Jesus Christ died on the cross, he did something not in the natural world as we see, but he did something in the spiritual world. He defeated death. Where all of a sudden the supernatural principalities and powers do not have that control over us anymore. Jesus Christ came in and ended that by saying there is no more power. You are toothless. You have no more power over these people anymore. You cannot determine their fate. Their fate is sealed up in what I have done in the supernatural realm and in their relationship with me. I take them through that. They now belong to me. That is D-Day. V-Day is still when Christ returns with his kingdom and establishes his kingdom on earth. That will be the day of victory, the day where he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more suffering, no more pain. That day is still there. We've had D-Day, which was Calvary on the cross. V-Day, that's still to happen. We live between the two. And that's where you and I are at. We still have to clean up the mess. There's still death to go through. There's still wars to go through. There's still battles to go through. But Victory Day is coming. And that's where we are as Christians. And the enemy knows it. And we know it. We have won. And so with the suffering and with the pain, there's an underlying truth that ultimately we will win this. It's a matter of time. God knows the day. But we are moving quickly to the day when God wins. It is the only option. It is the only destiny, is the victory that we have in Christ. And so you and I come into this thing looking at this, the battle that we are fighting. But now the battle is not against people, and the battle is not only against the evil principalities and powers. The battle is also in our noggin. It's in our head. And that's where the devil fights the very hardest. It's his last stronghold. It's the Berlin, if you will. He will not give that up. And you and I have to come in and recognize that God sees that, and the battle has taken place. That's the Armageddon, if you will, of where it all happens. It comes back down to us personally, inside of ourselves. And as we look at the enemy, let us not make a fatal mistake. And this is the fatal mistake. If you would look at the enemy and underestimate his power, if you would underestimate his willingness to destroy you, underestimate his ability to destroy. Because if you underestimate it, this is what you do. You begin to think, I can take care of this. I can battle this one on my own. I just need to read another book. I just need to develop another habit. I just need a little bit more willpower. I just need a different reward system out there. You're defeated. You have underestimated the enemy. Because reality says, I can do nothing against the evil forces that are arrayed against me, not only in this world, but also in the bigger world, the supernatural world. I can do nothing, and I'm hopeless against those. But with God, I can do it. God will do it. I have nothing to do it. Now let's go back to the Old Testament. What was the recipe, what was the formula for every victory and battle they had? Every time they went up to somebody who they should have been able to beat, they lost the battle. They lost that war. But every time they would go with God, God would say, oh, wow, look at all the enemy. There's so many. And the Israelites would go, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? This is terrible. We're all going to die. And then many times what would God do is, oh, you know what the problem is? Yes, we don't have enough soldiers. No, that's not the problem. The problem is we have too many soldiers. Let's get rid of some. Get it even. Like, oh no, now what are we going to do? Oh, get rid of the weapons. You guys got weapons. Get rid of that. Go in with torches and trumpets. You know, that's what you need. Tambourines. Oh, no, I need a catapult. I need this, I need that. No, you don't. Let's go in there. And when they would move into battle, the story's always the same. Under that formula, they won the battle. But they never say they was. Always God won the battle. And it's the same for you and for me in the battle of our head and of our mind. If we think we can defeat the power of evil or even hold it back, you are underestimating the enemy and your defeat is already sealed. But if we look at what God is trying to help us do, and we feel that God can do in our minds and in our lives, then we look to God and say, God, go to work. Let me be obedient and responsive to what you want to do. That's where God brings it about. Let God fight and win that battle in your head. Heard a beautiful story about a doctor named Dr. Brackett. And I'll close with this. Dr. Brackett, from the time he was a little boy, he had grown up with a passion to heal people who were very poor and could not afford medical care, medical treatment. And so he managed to make it all the way through school, and this is back in the 30s. And he went through medical school, and when he graduated, he was given many opportunities because he had done very well in school. But he had said, no, I'm going to go back down to the southern states and the borders of our country's border. I'm going to minister there to those who cannot afford medical care. And he went into a little town. He set up shop in a very humble office. In fact, it was above a clothing shop. And to find Dr. Brackett's office, you would walk down the street and there'd just be a door. And then they put a brass plaque on the door and it said, Dr. Brackett, office upstairs. That's where you'd go and found him come. Dr. Brackett never married. There was one time he could have married. I don't know how you would judge what he did, but this is what happened. I don't think many people would be happy with him. No, nobody was happy with him when he did this. The day of his wedding arrived, and he was all excited and all ready to go, when before he left, a Mexican man came running to him, and he said that the midwife had sent him to please come. If he does not come, you're certain to lose the wife and the baby. And so he had a moment to consider what to do now. He had to travel with the man back to help him and try to figure out what to do. And he's supposed to be there getting married, walk down the aisle, waiting at the end of the aisle for his bride. And in that moment, he decided to go with the husband and the father back down towards Mexico and save them. Meanwhile, back at the church, they didn't know, before cell phones. And they're waiting and waiting and waiting. And Dr. Brackett never showed up. People started talking. The bride's father said, I've waited long enough. We're bringing this to an end. He is not worthy of you if he cannot be here. And they disappeared, never to give him any attention again. And Dr. Brackett continued to do his thing. People got over their hate of him, the resentment they felt towards him and what the position he put this family in. And pretty much the only people that really appreciated Dr. Brackett for a long time was the Mexican father and the mother and the child that was born and lived. Well, he served his entire career there, and in his 70s, he passed away. People began to think about Dr. Brackett in the days after his passing and thought about, you know what, just about every one of us here has been helped at a critical time in our lives by this man's skill, this man's ministry, his love for us. And they started talking about what they could do to honor him, to memorialize him. And so they decided what we're going to do is we're going to erect a monument in his memory. And so they began the process of quickly assembling whatever they needed. But what happened is that one group of people disagreed with the other group about what size the monument should be, where it should be placed, what should be the wording on it. And they came to an impasse, and they couldn't agree, and nothing was ever done. And the story is that several weeks, months later, there still is no grave marker for Dr. Brackett. People are just mad at each other. When this father, whose wife and child had been saved because of his generosity and sacrifice, he was very poor. He couldn't afford a grave marker, didn't know what to do. But he went by, and sure enough, there on his door on the store in the street was still that brass plaque. He unscrewed it, and he took it, and he found a place, and had just a little stone there, and he leaned it up there against all the flowers. And for a long time, people would go by, and that plaque was the only thing there. Dr. Brackett, office upstairs. That's the way it's always been. For Dr. Brackett, the office was always upstairs. He was downstairs, he was running around doing the things, but the office, the boss, was always upstairs, giving the directions, talking about the priorities, giving the strategy. This is how we're going to do this, creating the culture. And even in death, Dr. Brackett, office upstairs, there he is. And for you and me, whatever your name is, the office is upstairs. God sees this huge picture that we only have a little glimpse of. But I want to talk to you in just closing now. When you pray, you have no idea how powerful your prayers are. They are not limited to this realm. Your prayers go into a whole nother realm of eternity that you have no idea about. Battles, spiritual battles, are going on for territories and space and dominions. You have no clue. When we pray, we think it's one little thing, but look what God is doing. Someday maybe the curtain will be held open and we can get a big glimpse of it all. But right now, when you pray, don't underestimate the amazing power of your prayers and how you are cooperating with God and his angels to bring about his purpose in this world. Never doubt the power, never doubt the activity, never doubt the presence of God. Isn't that true? God cares more about you than you care about yourself. God is doing more in your life than you will ever understand. And God's strength is made perfect in your weakness. Your weakness enables God's strength to take place. Let us pray.